And I'd like to welcome everyone to this event. My name is Olivia Mitchell. I teach at the Wharton School and I run the Pension Research Council. And on behalf of this international organization that we've founded jointly with the OECD, I welcome you all to the International Pension Research Association Symposium today. We're delighted to have you all here and delighted to have the opportunity to highlight some of the wonderful papers, except for mine, I don't want to be too bold, that were published in the Journal of Pension Economics and Finance under the guidance of Bob Clark and Joe Newhouse. The special edition, special issue was called Retirement Decisions in a Changing Labor Market. And without further ado, let me turn to Bob Clark and Joe Newhouse to introduce the overall volume. After that, we will have individual speakers talk about their papers. So without further ado, thanks again for being here, and let me turn it over to Bob Clark.
I'd also like to thank the International Pension Research Association for organizing this webinar and asking us to present papers based on our special issue, Retirement Decisions in a Changing Labor Market. And of course, this is a major issue today for both some long run and some short run trends. When we think about the labor market in the United States, but also around the world, we know there's certainly a movement along demographic long-term trends that really moves toward a population aging, increased life expectancy, more older workers wanting to stay on longer. That leads us into seeing that the labor force participation rates of older workers have been going up, and that's due in part to the increased life expectancy, improvements in health, changes in Social Security and pensions, and several other factors that we'll hear more about today. In the short run, we've of course had 2 years of pandemic issues that have really shaken the labor market in a very different sort of way. The pandemic actually came on after these papers were initially written and published, but perhaps some of our authors will have some implications for the pandemic based on their findings of a few years ago. We also know that employers are changing their preferences and trying to identify a optimal age structure for their workforces on the individual companies, and that's associated with productivity by age and age-specific compensation rates. And we also know that there are very big differences in public and private sectors in how their workers are treated with age compensation. So as we think about those issues, we had a grant from the Sloan Foundation, Joe and I did through the NBER, and that grant subsidized or allowed us to move forward with 2 particular conferences. They were both held in Jackson, Wyoming, and they were both published as special issues of the Journal of Pension Economics and Finance. And the one that we're going to be looking at is the conference that was in August of 2019, and the papers were published in July of 21. So if you have any issues associated with the presentations today, you can certainly go and look at the papers in the journal that are now available to everyone. So today we have 5 papers, 5 scholars who have written on these subjects in many different ways and papers. And we're going to be taking up the issues as you see in the course of the program. We will have a few questions, 1 or 2 at the most after each presentation. And then at the end of the 5th paper, we'll have about 25 minutes for question and answers, which will be moderated by Joe Newhouse. So each author, we're trusting them to stay on time, have about 12 minutes. I will give them a 2-minute heads up after 10 minutes. Then we'll take 1 or maybe 2 questions, depending on how long the question and answers are. And then we will get to the question session at the end. So since we're a very tight schedule, we're going to move straight into a paper by Robert Hammond of University of Alabama.
So this is a paper on work after retirement. It's with my colleague Bob Clark at NC State and our colleague, our former graduate student, Susann, who is now at Boston College. So glad to be able to present here. Thank you all for coming. So there's a lot of work on how people leave their career jobs, and we now, for a long time, are recognizing that this is a process. There's not a strict notion of retirement that is clean or is easy or is homogeneous across a large number of people. So what we want to do in this literature is understand how people go from exit from one job, from a career job to complete retirement. There's been a lot of work using data sets that we all know well, but most of the earlier work, at least as of the time that we were writing this paper, did not distinguish between public sector workers and private sector workers. So we're going to look at that question in specific. We're going to look at workers in North Carolina. We're going to look at state and local employees in North Carolina. And we build on a little bit of related work that does distinguish between public and private sector workers. And again, our context is in North Carolina. The differences between public and private sector workers we think are pretty large. Intuitively, we would expect them to be large. And we think that things might go in both directions, which again makes it worth studying. Public sector workers we think are going to retire earlier. That gives them more time to return to work. But they have compensation packages that are skewed in ways that might make them less likely to work. And how large these factors are and how they compare to each other is not clear, and certainly not clear from the literature, the earlier literature. There are rules that govern return to work behavior if you go into the same public employer. The public employers can be large, and so many of the opportunities that you might have after exiting your career job might be in similar jobs that are covered by the rules of these plans. So again, that might lead public sector workers to have very different opportunities in this period before complete retirement. So the Quinn et al. Paper that we build on here looks at public versus private sector workers and makes this comparison. What we contribute to this is detailed administrative data linked with a series of surveys, and allows us to do this analysis in a lot of detail using North Carolina workers. So what's going to be done in our paper is look at behavior within 2 years. And so retirement here is exit from the career job, so exit from the public sector job, and then we're going to be able to look at that for 2 years, and that's driven by our data, our survey data. So the administrative data here are quite rich. So we have this in 2014. We're focusing on workers that are 50 or older at the moment of getting this administrative data in 2014. And then using these data, we send a series of surveys. And we're going to talk about a couple of these different surveys. So what we want is folks who give us survey responses at several different moments in time, because that's going to allow us to do the analysis we want. And so we want to look at what % of these benefit claimants move to a new job between the two surveys, and we're going to try to explain that behavior. So we've got individuals who we observed in 2014 who were working, and then they claimed benefits in 16. And then likewise, we've got persons who were working in 16 who claimed benefits in 18, and that's going to give us our sample for this paper. What is in these data is a small but meaningful number of people that fit those sample criteria. So in the first sample, we have 261 folks. So again, these are benefit claimants by 16 who we observed working in 14. And so that is a rate of claiming of about 22%. And what we want to understand is what they did between observing them in 14 and then again in 16, and understanding their work after retirement behavior. Then our second sample gives us about 329 people. So again, we observed them working in 16, and they've claimed benefits by 18, and we want to know what they did in between. So just a quick look at the data here. So the first column is for all retirees. So this is the culmination of both of these samples. And then the middle column is our sample one. So that's working in 14, and the rightmost column is working in 16. So in total, this is about 600 people. The two samples look pretty similar, so we'll be pooling them in most of what we do in the paper. So go straight to our findings here. The key finding number one is that we get a lot of planning activity. Just one piece of evidence on that regard, roughly 70% of our sample say that they developed a retirement plan. And what we're really interested in knowing is how that plan maps into actual behavior. And so that leads directly to key finding number two. So there is a good amount of predictive behavior of the planning that maps into post-claiming work. So you claim benefits, so that means you exit your career employer in the public sector. 55% of folks who plan to work do in fact engage in post-claiming work. It's important to emphasize that this is an underestimate. We have 2 years really to observe this behavior. And so the plans that they engaged in might have not involved working in the first 2 years. And this is the only thing we see in our data, but even in this limited amount of time, we still see a lot of working, and we see a mapping between planning and to work and working. 21%, so if you didn't plan to work, actually did. So that number is smaller. The difference here is quite large in these summary statistics. Thirdly, when do you work? So what we see is that a big mass of folks go to work within 3 months of claiming benefits. So some of them go to work before they claim benefits. And here, as you might imagine, in these administrative data that are then linked to survey data, you get some idiosyncrasies. So here, the act of claiming can happen with some delay, and then reporting that you start another job. What we really do with these data is just lump these first leftmost bins together. And we think that it's really about half of people that give us the date at which they started that first job. That date is within 3 months of benefit claiming. So they go to work pretty quickly. Next, where do they work? You're not supposed to go back to work to the same system. So if you exit from the public system, there are rules that govern return to work behavior and how much you claim. So we see a certain amount of folks who do indicate that they go to work back in that same system. And we are left to a little bit of conjecture on what's going on there. But again, we have survey data that's self-reported. What we see is that we get some characteristics of these new jobs, and then we can map that up with what they plan to do. Likewise, part-time versus full-time work, we get a lot of part-time work, and we of course had a lot of plans to engage in part-time work. The next series of results come from a series of regressions. So we have probit models. What we're showing is average marginal effects. Just given the time, I'll just summarize this better in words, which will make it easier. But what the regression analysis on that previous slide says is that we can understand the planning to work behavior in reasonable ways, and then compare that to the literature. Men are more likely to plan to work. Married individuals are more likely to plan to work. Older workers are less likely. So again, in the administrative data at this moment where you're still working, if you were older at that moment, you're less likely to plan to work. Many of these things are as we would expect. Next, then, of course, we want to look at your actual work behavior. So again, summarizing better in words, the key point here is that if you plan to work, you're a lot more likely to have worked. And so there's an effect size here of 28 percentage points. And so on top of the folks who didn't plan to work, but who did, there's a 28 percentage point increase in work behavior. And so plans matter here. Plans are predictive of work behavior, which is reassuring for our analysis of plans. There's other effects there that are on that regression table, but I'll focus on this before moving to the final result here. Again, moving to the words, we have a set of subjective measures of retirement preparedness. We do some regression analysis of those. The results here are very much correlations, but in these correlations, what we interpret these results as telling us is that planning to work is people telling us that they don't feel prepared for retirement, and the realization of those plans to work is again an indication of low retirement preparedness. And so we have a couple of different measures, ways in which people tell us how they feel, how they're feeling about retirement, how things are going for them. And it seems that people are working when things aren't going well for them. And maybe that makes sense. The conclusion here, a lot of people are planning to work after retirement. The people who plan to work after retirement, many of them do plan to work after retirement, and plans don't map into behavior perfectly, but it's very strongly predictive. And we can predict that post-claiming work in ways that are consistent with the literature and ways that are interesting and important. And the evidence that we see gives suggestive correlative evidence that folks who plan to work and then folks who eventually work are doing so because they are approaching retirement feeling unprepared, which is intuitive but has strong policy implications.
Thank you, Bob. That's our time for the first paper. Now we're ready for Susann.
Thanks for the opportunity to share this research in this forum. And we, in this study, focus on the effect of job characteristics on labor force participation at older ages. And this is joint work with my RAND colleagues, Peter Hudemith, Michael Hurd, and Andrew Parker. And let's move forward here. A lot has been said about the need for those who can to work longer for various reasons that Bob alluded to in the introduction. And the overarching question in this talk is, can better job characteristics, if you will, increase labor force participation at older ages? And the role of working conditions, job characteristic, has in many ways been brought into focus more recently in the pandemic, during the pandemic, and the Great Resignation, as it's called. Of course, the data we are presenting here were collected before the pandemic, but still, you'll see there are some interesting things also related to work from home and so on that became more important during the pandemic, as we all know, presenting from home. Anyways, here we go. So could better job characteristics increase labor force participation of older workers? That is, if we offered them things like, employers offered them things like more flexible work hours, part-time jobs, greater options of part-time jobs, maybe adaptations so that the job isn't quite as stressful or the physical demands aren't quite so intense. Would that allow or even lead some people or more people to work to older ages? That's the overarching question here. To identify the causal effects of working conditions, job characteristics, is empirically quite hard. First of all, randomized controlled trials are not really an option in this realm, at least not easily. And then usually we turn to observed patterns in labor force participation, but they don't make it there. We cannot easily tell preferences apart from constraints. It's a mishmash. So despite these headwinds, we try to make some progress here using evidence from a rich survey that we designed and fielded. And we'll look at the issue of job characteristics from multiple angles. And the main results are in this paper that was part of this special issue and a couple of companion papers. And so the angles we examine is, first of all, what pathways from full-time work to eventually retirement do workers actually prefer? And then we also ask what gets in the way, if you will, for people to work to older ages. And here we ask workers about their beliefs about what are the important factors getting in the way of working longer. And then we turn to the role of job characteristics, measuring what across a number of dimensions, what are the current features of the jobs, of their current jobs, and then compare that to the characteristics, the desired job characteristics for a job that a person might want to take and reasonably then work at those older ages later in their 60s, and where are their gaps? And then we want to know, does it matter in terms of quantities? Would changing people's job characteristics actually lead to later retirement? And if so, how much? And to find out, we turn to eliciting retirement expectations with and without the availability of certain job characteristics, and you'll see what we find. We designed a rich survey and fielded it in the Rand American Life panel. It has been around for a while. It's an internet panel, and the data come from late 2017, early 18. And for most analysis here, we use a sample age 50 to 69 of persons who either are currently working or at least at some recent attachment to the labor force to make sure that the concept of retirement was a meaningful concept here. So, in broad brush strokes, given the limited time, what did we find? First, on what type of retirement trajectories do people prefer? We asked respondents to rate 9 pathways of transitioning from full-time work to eventual retirement. And some involved an abrupt transition from full-time work to then full-time retirement, if you will, with some variation in at what age that would happen. Others involved a transition via part-time work or via self-employment or retire and then return to work. And overall, we found that a vast majority, some 2/3 of workers, preferred what we call the traditional pathway. That is a transition from full-time work to then promptly, abruptly retiring sometime in their 60s. Yet, in some related work, we show that when you look in, say, the health and retirement study at actual retirement trajectories, only about 1/3 of workers actually follow this traditional pathway. And so there again comes the question, what are the various things that get in the way? Can we mold a fold? Here is one thing that we turn to in the context of the interest of what keeps people from working longer. We asked them to rate and to tell us what they thought for them personally were important factors that might limit their ability to continue working until, say, age 70. And here is what we found. The most often cited limiting factor, if you will, were health problems. Some 54% of the sample said that this would be an important barrier to working to advanced ages. Job demands were second most cited by 47%, but also note taking care of others. That's something that for some 40%, just shy of 40%, they think that will be a barrier to them working to those later ages. Business conditions were, as in, are you concerned that there'll be a job available to you at those later ages, were mentioned by either as many or as few, depending how you want to see it, by about 1/3. And however, relatively few were concerned that their employer might not allow them to work to those advanced ages, that they would not extend their contract. What about now job characteristics? So here we asked workers about the features of their current job, or most recent job, if they were not currently working, across some 14 dimensions. Then these fell broadly speaking into cognitive dimensions, physical demands of the job, and social aspects. And we wanted to then to compare that to their desired job characteristics, and not just any kind of wishful thinking, but say, suppose you were to take a job in your 60s, and these are all people in their 50s and 60s, so kind of a pre-retirement job that you would want to take. What would be important features of that job? And then we compared their current job characteristics along these 14 dimensions to their desired job characteristics. And broadly speaking, while there's some heterogeneity, of course, older workers wanted their kind of pre-retirement jobs to be less cognitively demanding, less physically demanding, a little bit more social. Comfortable temperatures are good too. They cared a lot about flexibilities in schedules, that is, schedule flexibility. Now, what about how much that moves the needle? If we gave people more of the job characteristics that they care for, that they want, would that in fact increase their labor force participation at older ages? And if so, by how much? And here again in the survey, we then turned to eliciting retirement expectations. In the probabilistic format, that's important, we feel, providing some room for uncertainty in the answers. And here is how these questions go. What are the chances that you'll be doing any work for pay after you reach age 70? This is a fairly commonly used question. A lot of research, not just by us, but a lot of people, highly predictive of future labor force participation, varies by all the various things that you think it ought to vary with. And let's call this, if you will, P70 for shorter hands and this whole sentence of mouthful. And we'll add a twist now because we're interested in how working conditions would move that around, these responses around. So then these questions go like this. Suppose your employer allowed you to work a flexible schedule while holding the total number of hours constant. In this case, what are the chances you'd be doing any work for pay after age 70? And then we can ask a similar question, but take away that condition. Suppose you were not allowed to use a flexible schedule and so on and so forth. What would be the chance of working for pay after age 70? And when we take the difference of P70 with the condition minus P70 without the condition. That's what is equivalent to, if you will, the causal effect of this work condition. It's within person even, and we call that the subjective causal effect. We can measure it at the individual level, but of course then compute averages for subgroups and also at the population level. So what do we find here? When looking at how much the ability to choose one's schedule flexibly versus not, how much does that shift the average population P70, average probability of working past age 70. So having flexible schedule, then we get an average P70 of 32%. Without the condition that is no flexible schedule, we would get about 17%. So you see that's a difference of 15 percentage points, a shift in probability of working of 15%. That's quite sizable. Then you can go down the list of the various working conditions that we queried and try to quantify and ordered them by size of effect. And so the next up is then how stressful a job is, stressful versus not so stressful, and it shifts by about 11 percentage points. And you see the other effect sizes down here. Because we can, and then how does it compare in effect sizes to other factors that are considered, that have been found to be important, determinants of retirement, say being in health, good health versus poor health. That changes the probability of working past age 70 by 21%. Large change in wealth, say inheritance of 500,000 would be reducing by 16%, which is sort of in line of magnitude of flexible schedules. Again, we can then also analyze the heterogeneity in these effects because we compute them at the individual level, can run regressions on them. Just briefly, a preview of the kind of things you might look at. Flexible schedules, not big difference by gender, education, or race, but if people are allowed to work from home, then we find small effects. Maybe that already allows for some flexibility. And then to wrap up, overall, a large fraction of older workers, they do want still the traditional full-time work to retirement, full-time retirement pathways, but there's some heterogeneity certainly. And job characteristics are important to workers, and especially older workers, where there's more greater elasticity of labor supply. And they want their jobs to be, the pre-retirement jobs, to be less cognitive, still interesting, less physical, but they do care a lot about hours flexibility. And that's reflected also in the quantitative estimates that we produced here on the job characteristics, where we found the largest effects in hours flexibility, the amount of stress, physical demands, and commute times. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Susann. So our next speaker, Geoffrey Sanzenbacher from Boston College.
So today I want to present work on how older workers use non-traditional jobs. And I'll define exactly what I mean by non-traditional in a second. The role of non-traditional jobs has gained a lot of attention recently. And I think this attention has been fueled by the rise of things like Uber. And I think since the pandemic, things that we've all become more aware of, I'm sure, like DoorDash. And I think the reason that people are interested in these jobs is that a lot of times they lack benefits. And so people who are in these jobs a lot may not be able to save for retirement. We know most people only save for retirement if they have a plan. And then maybe their finances may be vulnerable to health shocks because they don't have insurance. And so I think the rise of these jobs fuels concern because of this idea they may lack benefits or stability. On the other hand, workers who use these jobs only briefly, maybe as a stopgap when they're unemployed briefly or as a bridge to retirement, as they may suffer little financially. And so we had this question, basically, how do older workers use these jobs? Are they using them a lot, or are they using them occasionally, maybe as a way to bridge a gap in employment? And in this particular paper, we were looking specifically at late career workers, so workers pre-retirement age, so their 50s and early 60s, although we've also done some work on non-traditional jobs among workers of kind of retirement age in their 60s. You know, the reason we did this work is because the literature wasn't super clear on how these jobs were used. Some people suggested these kinds of non-traditional arrangements were used as stepping stones from maybe a more traditional job with benefits to a job without benefits and then kind of on to retirement. Other people suggested that once people move into these kinds of jobs, there was no real going back. And so they were used somewhat permanently once they were switched into. And so thinking about how do older workers use these sorts of jobs, was basically the goal of this particular paper. And in this paper, we use something called sequence analysis, and it's not a technique that's familiar, to a lot of us. So I'm going to go through an example in 1 second. But basically, what we did is we took people in the health and retirement study, and we followed them for 12 years, from their early 50s until they were 62 years old. And we identified them as either working in a traditional job or non-traditional job, which I'll define clearly in the next section. Not working at all, or retired. So not working means they weren't working, but they didn't say they were retired yet. And what the sequence analysis does basically is it identifies people who have a similar pattern of their working behavior from their early 50s on to their early 60s. And it groups them into patterns that are similar. And then we can analyze those patterns to see how do non-traditional jobs fit into those patterns of work. And so that was what we were doing. And sequence analysis is probably something you haven't heard about, but it's really not a horribly scary thing. And so I'll give you a quick example. This is basically what we did with people in our data. We have 3 workers in this example, and we're following them every other year from age 50 to 62 and defining them as traditional, non-traditional, or not working at all, that's a U, and then retired, an R. And so what sequence analysis tries to do is group these workers into similar groups. And so, for example, it might say, hey, worker A and worker B look pretty darn similar. In fact, the only difference between worker B and worker A is that you could just change one of worker B's behavior from a traditional at age 56 to a non-traditional, and they would look exactly like worker A. So it might say, look, worker A and worker B, those folks are very similar to each other. So let's group them together. But worker C looks quite a bit different. We'd have to kind of take 2 traditional jobs and insert them at the end of their career, get rid of their non-traditional work, and then give them a retirement at the end of their career. So worker C looks very, very different than worker A and B. They have a lot of differences, especially at the end of their career. They look like they're doing something a little bit different. They look more like they're doing a traditional job and then slowly transitioning to not working at all. And that's quite a bit different than worker A and B, who go from traditional to non-traditional and back again. And so worker C might be given a different sequence. Of course, all of this requires us to identify people who are in non-traditional jobs. And so how do we do this? A lot of work on non-traditional work arrangements focuses on the relationship between the employer and the employee. So for example, maybe the most common way of defining it is something called alternative work arrangements. These are jobs that are contingent, are expected to end, or where the employee is an independent contractor, not really an employee, but instead a worker for some establishment, or where the worker might be a contract employee. So maybe they're hired by a janitorial service firm, but they're contracted out to a college, for example, or temporary workers. So that definition really relies on what is this employee's relationship to their employer. We instead looked at the characteristic of the job. Does it have benefits or not? Once we do that, we then do the sequence analysis and we explore who uses non-traditional jobs and also what do they do to workers' retirement outcomes. To give you a sense of like how this definition compares to the multitude of definitions that are out there, this chart, the red bar here is our definition. So we found in the CPS that about 20% of workers were in non-traditional jobs from ages 50 to 62. And we use the CPS for this chart just to draw an apples to apples comparison with some of the other numbers that are out there. You know, if you just identify non-traditional jobs as gig workers, so jobs like platform things like Uber, DoorDash, things like that, you'd only find about 1%. That's on the far left of the graph there. On the other hand, if you took the alternative definition I described in the BLS that kind of made famous by Katz and Kruger's series of papers, that'd be about 11% of all workers. And then if you went really broad, as the GAO did in a paper, you might find up to a third of workers are somehow contingent. They even included part-time works in their definition. So our definition is on the higher end, but kind of in the middle of what's out there. So that's our no benefit definition. The one thing I'll say about it is our definition does identify a more vulnerable set of workers than does the alternative definition. So what we have here is a table where the left column is alternative workers. And you can see that a lot of quote unquote alternative workers have actually been doing that kind of work for a long time. Their average tenure is 11 years. Their household income is fairly close to the typical distribution. $67,000 is roughly the median household income. Demographics, 65% have some college, 20% non-white. If you take our definition and get rid of those alternative folks, you see a much more vulnerable population. And the real reason for that is the alternative definition that's kind of used as one benchmark of non-traditional work, that includes a lot of independent contractors. And independent contractors actually tend to be higher income and tend to have been doing that work for a while, maybe as their career. And so in a way, we are looking at a more vulnerable set of workers, maybe than some of the other definitions of alternative work that are out there. The output of sequence analysis is a grouping of similar patterns. And, I showed you some CPS numbers. The HRS yields a similar number of workers in these sorts of jobs, about 17%. And the sequence analysis told us that 5 groupings was the optimal number that we should be looking at. And this is what it spit out. This is a little bit complicated to look at, but I'll explain it. So each of the kind of tan boxes here is a worker in a traditional job at that point in time. Red is non-traditional, black means they're not working, and gray means they're retired. And so there were 5 groupings identified here. Early retirement. You can see at the top there, 21% of all workers were basically in an early retirement sequence. You can see that they retired early. It's aptly named. We did a good job with the naming. Weak attachment means that these workers were kind of moving in and out of jobs, moving between traditional and non-traditional, moving between not working and retired. They were just kind of weakly attached to the labor market. Mostly non-traditional. These are workers who were in non-traditional jobs a lot. You see a lot of red in that group. Mostly traditional is workers who were in mostly traditional work with occasional bouts of non-traditional work. And then we see people who were in traditional work the whole time. One of the things that we found really interesting about this is I think all of us, probably a lot of us on this webinar, have in our mind that people work at a job with benefits throughout the 50s and early 60s consistently, probably in the same job, this kind of nice, smooth 50s. And what we see is that is very, very rare. Only about 26% of our people were in this kind of job their entire 50s. It was much more common for people to move around a little bit. And so that is worth just keeping in mind, one of the things that fell out of this. With respect to our original question, what we see is non-traditional jobs are very rarely used as a kind of stopgap. The vast majority of non-traditional work is done in sequences that are mostly non-traditional. So we're seeing most of these jobs are done by people who are doing them a lot. Only 9.6% of non-traditional jobs were done by people who were mostly in traditional work, but were just briefly in non-traditional work. That's the gray slice of the pie. 11% were done by people who retired early, and then 26% were done in people who are weakly attached to the labor market. So if you add up the red pie slice and the black pie slice, that means nearly 80% of all non-traditional jobs are done by people who are either doing those jobs a lot or who were in otherwise precarious employment situations. So we didn't see a lot of people using these jobs as a stopgap between traditional jobs or as a bridge to retirement. So that's something, that's, I think, the main finding of the paper. We also looked at who exactly are doing these sequence groups. And so the all traditional group is on the far right. And what you can see is people who are using mostly non-traditional jobs, if we look at this, this column here, those jobs, they look a little bit more vulnerable. They look a little bit more vulnerable than the far right column. They are, slightly more likely to be non-white, less likely to be college graduates, less likely to be married, certainly less likely to have any kind of benefits in their past, which makes sense. And they have lower net worth. So there is certainly a difference there, but it's not extreme. And the reason for that is we got a little confused by this. So we dug a little deeper. And what we saw was if you look within that group of people who are using those jobs frequently, you see a mixture of people. It's not a homogeneous population. We use this thing called latent class analysis to basically divide this group up into its component parts. And among non-traditional workers, there were really 3 groups. One was very disadvantaged. 15% of that group were high school dropouts. But another 30% were married people who had an earning spouse. So maybe they just didn't need to have a traditional job. They're kind of more advantaged. And 49% were well-educated solo earners. It wasn't clear at all why they were in these sorts of jobs. So, digging into this group a little deeper, you see why they only look a little bit more disadvantaged, because there's a wide range of people in that group. It's not a monolith. And the last point is, probably not surprisingly, given these workers spend a lot of their time in jobs without benefits, they're less prepared for retirement at age 62. This is very descriptive, not necessarily causal. We try to control for race, gender, education, marital status, health status. What we found was, compared to all workers who spend their entire 50s and early 60s in traditional work, mostly non-traditional workers end up at retirement with about a quarter less retirement income than those workers. And so being in these jobs that consistently does affect what's available for your retirement. And so, in conclusion, we saw that non-traditional work was being used by these folks consistently. It was not really being used very often as a stopgap between traditional work, nor was a transition to retirement. Those working non-traditional jobs ended up with less retirement income, even controlling for other factors. Whether this is causal or not is a different question. Certainly, it does seem like some workers fall into this pattern because they are less educated, some because they presumably have a choice because they have an earning spouse with benefits. But there is this weird group of kind of well-educated solo earners where it's unclear why exactly they're in this pattern of non-traditional work. And I think it's worth thinking about these workers a little bit more as we go forward. But in any case, that's my conclusion. So I thank you, and I'll
Thank you for your comments on your paper. And our next speaker is Courtney Coile from Wellesley.
So this is joint work with Susann Stewart, who's a researcher at the National Bureau of Economic Research. And really the motivation for this work was the well-known trend that defined benefit pension plans have become more and more rare in recent decades. So you got some newspaper headlines here, people feeling kind of bereft without their defined benefit pension plan. And then another trend that we're all extremely aware of is the increase in working longer, the higher rates of participation at older ages. So, there's reason to think that these two trends could end up being related. This is a well-known paper by Leora Friedberg and Tony Webb that shows that basically these two types, the defined benefit type of pension plan and then the defined contribution or 401k style plan that in many cases has come to replace them, they're quite different in terms of the incentives that they give workers at older ages. And I'll explain this a little bit more in detail a little bit later, but basically these defined benefit plans often had strong incentives in them to work until particular ages and then to retire once you get beyond those ages. Defined contribution plans, by contrast, don't have the same kind of incentives. And this one particular study estimated that removing those age-specific incentives could lead a worker to work 2 years longer. So there's no particular reason to think that defined benefit shifts away from defined benefit plans are the whole reason that workers are retiring, working longer. There's lots of other candidate explanations, but this could certainly be one factor. So I became interested in thinking about whether this story about defined benefit plans going away and people working longer and there being a possible connection, whether the same thing was being experienced by public sector workers. So this was a study by some of our fine friends at the Center for Retirement Research some years ago now, but pointing out that defined benefit plans, perhaps have not gone away to the same extent in the public sector that they have in the private sector. So as I said, this is sort of the motivation for this study. I wanted to have a better understanding of whether the incentives for work at older ages might be changing differentially for public versus private sector workers, and whether, and if that's true, I was interested in whether there might also be different trends in retirement behavior that could be explained in part by these different incentives. And so this analysis will first document some of the trends over time in retirement behavior and in pension plan type that workers have by sector to see if those trends are similar. Second, we're going to look at the financial incentives for work at older ages that arise from both private pension or both pensions that employer-sponsored pensions, as well as Social Security. Look at how those incentives might be different across sectors and how that's changed over time. And then explore whether public and private sector workers respond similarly to these financial incentives at older ages. Again, going back to the original goal of having this idea of whether incentives are changing differently and whether that's linked to differences changes in retirement behavior. So I need to give you a little bit of background on DB pensions, just in case we don't all have the same amount of information about how these plans work. Basically, there's a lot of features, and these plans are highly heterogeneous. They're set up by employers, and so plans are very individual. But some of the things you commonly find is, first of all, a vesting, a period of time that you need to work before you would become eligible for benefits once you subsequently leave the firm. Also, these plans might have an early retirement age, so you might need to work until you reach some age or some years of service or some combination of age and years of service to be eligible to start receiving benefits. In many cases, your benefits will continue to increase if you work beyond that early retirement age until you reach some normal retirement age. And then just to give you a sense, a benefit formula is often based on years of service and your final or some measure of average earnings. So like, for example, a formula might be 2% times the number of years of service times your average earnings in the past 3 years. And what's important to know is that all of these different features in combination with the person's own work history, what age they were when they started the job, et cetera, may create these wealth accrual trajectories that have sharp spikes. And so I just want to show that by showing some figures from this paper by Kostrel and Podgorski. So this is showing basically the present discounted value of retirement wealth. So that is, if we think about after you retire and start claiming your benefits, the stream of benefits you're going to get over your whole life. And we kind of think of that in terms of its today's value, wealth equivalent. This is showing how that present discounted value is evolving as the person continues to stay on the job and work. And what you can see is it's not like a constant slope, right? There's ages where this is rising more rapidly and ages where it's not rising as rapidly, including a period in the late 60s where it's actually starting to decline. You can see this more obviously in this picture, which is showing us the year-to-year changes. And I'm less interested in explaining exactly why there's a spike at this point or a dip in that point, as just pointing out that these accrual patterns often have this sort of nature of peaks and valleys, right? There's often strong incentives to work until a specific age. This is measured as a % of salary. So by working to this age, you can have an accrual of retirement wealth that's more than 100% of wages in that particular year. And you can also see that these turn negative. So people are leaving a considerable amount of money on the table. That is, they're losing retirement wealth if they stay beyond a certain point. And so let me turn a little bit more to what we're actually doing in this paper. So the first thing is that we're going to use data from the current population survey to talk about retirement trends. And what I'm going to show you here is going to be what I'll call the employment survival curve by sector. Now, the CPS doesn't actually follow the same people over time. So I've sort of approximated this by saying, if we take the people who are working, let's say in the public sector at age 55, then let's look at the share of them that are still working, or sorry, let's look at the number of people who are working in the public sector at age 56, 57, and so on. So that's what I'm going to graph. Mostly we're going to use the Health and Retirement Study, or HRS data, to look at how plan type is changing across cohorts, also to calculate these measures of Social Security and pension entitlement. So there's the present discounted value measure I was already talking about, and then peak value, which is the difference between basically the wealth you've already accrued, you've already earned a right to based on your work to date, and if you work to the date where that wealth is maximized, what's that difference? How much more can you increase your wealth by working to sort of the best possible date is what that is a measure of. And then I'll estimate models relating those incentives to behavior. So here we go. So here's the CPS employment survival curves. So this is roughly for 3 decades. You can roughly think of it as the 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s, roughly speaking. So we see this working longer trend that we're all familiar with. So at any given age, the fraction of people who are, of those who were working at 55, the fraction who are still working at any given age, like 62 or 65, is something like 10 or 15 percentage points higher when you compare this latest period to the first period. Now I'm going to take away the orange line and leave the blue and the gray, so the earliest and the latest period. But now I'm going to show you this separately for private sector workers and state and local. So private sector is the solid line and state and local workers is the one with the triangles. And basically these series look very similar, right? So both in the sort of early period, the rate at which people, leave the labor force at different ages looks pretty similar across these two groups, and the increase in work also looks pretty similar across these two groups. So this was almost like the first surprise for me in doing this work. We repeated this graph with federal employees. I should say this time series is a little bit noisier. There's only about 1/4 as many federal workers as compared to state and local. So you're doing this based off a smaller number of people. So the series is a little noisier, but there's some evidence that federal workers might be retiring a little bit earlier as compared to private sector workers. And perhaps that this increase, like say from this one blue line with triangles to the gray line with triangles, perhaps not as much of an increase in working longer as what we see with the private sector workers. Now to plan type. This is self-reported plan type when people first enter the survey. And so I first wanted to point out that in the private sector, as probably people know, only about half of people have pension plans. But if we look at the pension plan type, we see that shift away from the defined benefit and towards the defined contribution that we're expecting to see. For the public sector workers, first of all, pension coverage is much more common, right? So there's only about 1/5 of workers who don't have pensions. And, but perhaps surprisingly, we also see a shift away from defined benefit and into defined contribution, or into having both defined benefit and defined contribution. Now, this might slightly overstate what has actually happened. Recall that this is self-reported data. And there are cash balance plans, a specific type of plan, which is a DB plan, but it shares many of the features of a defined contribution. It's possible that there's some misclassification of work by workers of their plan type. Nonetheless, perhaps the second surprise for me here was that there's been as much movement as there has been in plan type for public sector workers as well. This is something about people's wealth entitlement. So you can see, first of all, comparing the two yellow squares, that public sector workers have higher retirement wealth entitlements than private sector workers. And if you see the amounts from Social Security only, you can see that the differences are really being driven by their higher pension entitlements, which isn't super surprising. Now, if we compare what's been happening over time, we can see that these differences that were apparent even in the first cohort have been exacerbated over time, these retirement wealth differences between private and public sectors. And the final thing I wanted to call your attention to is these peak value measures. So that's the sort of benefit of working to the optimal future date. So public sector workers have a stronger incentive to stay in the labor force until that optimal date, more to be gained. And largely that's because they're more likely to have pensions and more likely to have defined benefit pensions. And those differences have also gotten bigger over time. The last bit of it. Okay, thanks. The last bit of analysis we did was this thing with was seeing how responsive people are to their own financial incentive measures. And I just wanted to focus on these peak value results. The negative sign is what we expect. So basically that says, if you compare across workers, people who have a bigger financial incentive to stay in the labor force, that is more to gain if they wait till that optimal future date, they're less likely to retire as compared to other workers. So that's what we would expect. These differences, there are some differences across public and private sector workers, but they're not enormous, and they're not necessarily statistically significant in how responsive people are. So that takes me to concluding what we found from this work. So we found that the changes over time in retirement behavior were similar for public and private sector workers, especially when you focus on state and local workers. A little bit harder to say what's going on with federal workers. They might still be retiring a bit earlier. We saw that both public and private sector workers experienced a shift in their type of plan from DB to DC. And that when we compare kind of the wealth that people have accrued through their work, public sector workers have both more retirement wealth and a larger financial gain for working till the kind of optimal date. And those differences are only growing over time. We did find that public and private sector workers are similarly responsive to their incentives for continued work. And so whereas I started thinking that I might see this sort of diverging retirement behavior that could be explained by diverging incentives, what I ended up learning from this project was that public sector workers have not been exempt from changes in pension plan types, nor are they exempt from the working longer trends. Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. Our next speaker is Olivia Mitchell from Wharton.
So this is a paper which I have written with my frequent co-author, Raymond Maurer. And the question that drove our analysis, our interest, was whether older workers might be willing to delay Social Security claiming if, instead of getting a relatively small increase in their annual benefit, if instead they could get a lump sum, which was equivalent in present value to the increase in benefit that they would earn if they delayed. So let me explain this, and then I'll talk to you about the experiment that we ran. So in the US, we have something the government has called the full retirement age, otherwise known as FRA. And this is just a name. It doesn't mean you have to work that long or you can't work after that. But they decided to call this the full retirement age because that's the age at which you are entitled to your unreduced benefit. So this has changed over time. In 1937 or before, the conventional retirement age, the full retirement age, was 65. You could retire and claim your benefits as early as 62, but you would get a 20% benefit cut. Over time, the so-called full retirement age has been increased. So in my cohort, 66, for all you young things on this program, it's probably 67. And it may have to go up even more in the future, but that's where it's halted right now. So if you were born 1960 and later, you would get a 30% benefit cut if you claimed at age 62. And so the way to think about that is that this is the full age. If you defer claiming to age 70, then you get a benefit increment. So it's not like this full retirement age is really anything normal or anything conventional, but the government just decided to call that the full retirement age. So the full retirement age has been rising. And as you see in this chart, the benefit cut that you get if you quit and claim benefits as early as 62 is increasing over time. So what we see is that over time, there has been some decline in the fraction claiming Social Security at age 62. So back in 1990, it was about half of men and women. And by 2008, it was about 40% of the women and maybe 35% for men, but it's still a goodly chunk. And in fact, most of the rest of the people still claim well before the maximum benefit age, which is age 70. So this was what we started thinking about. Is there some way we could persuade people to claim later, which would increase their benefits once they did claim, and potentially to work longer, which would obviously help the Social Security system because people would be paying in payroll taxes for longer. So what we did was we calculated essentially the change in claiming age, and using the current retirement rules, which has the full retirement age at 66 when we wrote the paper. So if you claim at 62, the benefit as a percentage of your full primary insurance amount is 75. As you defer claiming, you get a jumpy bump, a jumpy benefit increase. And indeed, if you claim all the way at 70 instead of at 62, your benefit is 76% higher from that point forward. Now, when this schedule was put in place, it was deemed roughly actuarially fair. That may or may not be actuarially fair depending on interest rates at the time and mortality tables and so on. But let's accept that your benefit would be a lot higher if you delayed claiming until 70. So our question was whether people would delay claiming Social Security more if the benefit boost came as an actuarially fair lump sum instead of a higher lifetime annuity. And if they said yes, then we would ask them, how much less would you take than the actuarially fair amount? If they said no, then we asked them, how much more would you need than the actuarially fair amount? So we broke this into two different parts. The first just says, if you could delay claiming and self-finance or keep, not necessarily keep working the additional years, would you do it? What about if you had to work longer to get the lump sum. So those are the two scenarios. And obviously this is interesting to the extent that many people have suggested that it could well be healthier for people to work longer. They stay integrated, they network, et cetera. And as I mentioned, it could help Social Security solvency. So this builds on several literatures on optimal claiming, some by Courtney and others on the call. We know that Social Security affects labor supply. There are a bunch of studies of which I've done several asking how Social Security shapes people's investments, their annuitization, their work hours, and et cetera. And this study uses a health and retirement module collected in 2016. So we have people age 51 to 70, closest to that claiming age, and we have about 900 respondents. So here's the thought experiment that we ask people to keep in mind. And this is the status quo where you don't have to work any extra. And I'll talk about the second case in a minute. So assume you're age 62 and single. You're thinking about when to claim your Social Security benefit. If you claim it at 62, you will receive $1,000 per month for life. So you take that as the hypothetical. Now imagine you have a choice. Either you can receive that $1,000 monthly benefit from age 62 for life, or you can delay receiving the benefit until age 66, which at the time was the full retirement age. So this said, ask people to assume that if you delay, assume you have enough savings to live on without having to work extra from 62 to 66. And the government will neither lose nor make money as a result. What we're doing by saying that, in effect, for those people in the know, is that these are actuarially fair benefit improvements. In exchange for delaying your Social Security benefit to age 66, you will receive a monthly benefit of $1,330 per month from age 66 on. Would you be willing to delay receiving? So this is essentially the information treatment where we say to people, this is the way the rules currently work. What do you plan to do under the status quo? So this is the status quo case. Next, we present the lump sum alternative. So we say now, suppose that in exchange for delaying your Social Security benefit to age 66, you will receive a monthly benefit of $1,000 per month. That's the same amount that we showed you before if you claim at 62. But in addition, you'll get a lump sum of $60,000 payable at age 66. You don't get it if you say you're going to work longer, but don't do it at 62. You have to keep delaying claiming to age 66. Would you be willing to delay receiving your benefit to 66? If you said, wow, yeah, 60,000, that sounds like a good number, then we ask them how much less would you be willing to receive? And if you said, no, 60,000 isn't enough, we ask them how much more would you be willing to receive? Now, again, with the status quo with work, what we ask them is, again, we assume you're age 62 and single. If you claim your Social Security benefits at 62, you will receive $1,000 per month for life. Now imagine you can choose, you can either get that $1,000 monthly from 62 for life, or you can delay receiving the benefit until age 66. But here's the slightly different caveat. If you delay, assume you must work at least half time. So under this condition, if you delay claiming to age 66, you'll get a monthly benefit of $1,330 per month from 66 on. Would you be willing to delay receiving your benefit and work half time until 66? So with work, once again, we said, okay, if you work at least half time, you'll receive a monthly benefit of $1,000, but only from age 66, plus a lump sum of $60,000 payable from that age. Would you do it? If you said yes, would you accept less than $60,000? If you said no, we'd say, how much more would you have to be paid? So what do we find? In terms of the no work situation, we find that people say they would be willing to delay claiming under the actuarially fair lump sum. 70% of them said that they would like to delay claiming versus the status quo. It's about a 20 percentage point or 41% increase in delayed claiming. We also looked at various controls by sex, by age, education, health. Most of the differences were not significant by any of those metrics: cognition, number of kids. And people were willing to delay more under the status quo, given the lump sum. What kind of dollar amounts are we talking? People under the no work scenario said, I'd be willing to delay claiming for about $60,000, 60.4 on average, which is roughly actuarially fair. So that's kind of interesting. But 70% said that they would be willing to delay claiming for a lower amount than the actuarially fair amount. So that suggests that if you were to do something like this, Social Security might actually recover a little bit of extra money, which might be helpful because they're running short. We do find significant differences among the higher income and the educated people. They wanted higher lump sums, and people who were already willing to delay under the status quo wanted lower lump sums. And then with half-time work required, what we found is, not surprisingly, fewer people would be willing to delay under the actuarially fair lump sum. There were some differences. People that were less educated were less willing to continue working half-time to get the lump sum. People in bad health, not surprisingly, were less willing to continue half-time work to get the lump sum. And the dollar amount was up a little bit, of $63,000, almost $64,000 versus $60,000. But the interesting thing is, this implies that the leisure foregone from part-time work until the delayed claiming age is not worth very much, only about $3.3 thousand on average. And still over half said, yes, I would delay for $53,000. And there are some differences across subgroups. So in sum, what did we find? There is clear evidence that, I mean, we kind of know this already from the annuity literature. A lot of people prefer lump sums over annuities. And this, I think, reiterates the point. More older people would delay claiming if they were given a lump sum for the benefit increase. And many of them would still work longer. If they got a lifelong benefit, they could have gotten it 62, but they get it 6 years or 4 years later, plus this actuarially fair lump sum payment. And part of that is they just don't necessarily value an annuity as much as the lump sum. In a separate paper, we estimated how much less people would take than the actuarially fair amount. And our other paper estimated that about 87% of the $60,000 lump sum would produce about the same claiming age as what we see now under the status quo. So there is some potential saving for asking people if people were allowed to take the actuarial lump sum or a little bit less compared to now. So why is this relevant? Well, as I said at the outset, longer working lives could potentially be healthier for people. It may enhance system solvency. It's certainly not going to fix the whole shortfall that Social Security faces, but it could be a viable way politically, instead of taking away something from people, instead of saying you can't get a benefit increase, we'll say, yeah, you get a benefit increase if you delay, and a big hunk of money too. And that's pretty persuasive. Of course, the reforms are necessary because the Social Security piggy bank on the right says, of course I don't jiggle, I'm full of red ink. There's certainly a lot of projected shortfalls. And this is the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, projects exhaustion of the Social Security Trust Fund very soon, right around the corner. The trustees, the official government folks project a later exhaustion date, but this is in the matter of small change at this point. We do face major shortfalls. So with that, here's our publicity on Wharton's Pension Research Council. And I think I asked Silky also, and maybe Hazel, to put up the URL for the IPRA International Pension Research Association website, and I thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Olivia.
So yeah, I'd like to thank everyone for presenting this morning. I'd like to especially thank Bob Clark for putting this together. And yeah, we've had terrific speakers. I'd also like to remind you to join IPRA, the International Pension Research Association. So we've been going for a few years now, and we have events most months. So we have webinars, we have an annual conference, we run PhD tutorials for PhD students associated with our institutions, and we're developing resources and other things. So I encourage you very strongly to join our association. So again, I would like to thank everyone who spoke today. I would like to thank everyone who attended, and I'd like to encourage you to join our next webinar in a month's time. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are, and thank you very much.